All right, I'm going to try to make one push here to the end of all of our materials. I'll try to speak quickly here. So what causes flooding? There's a couple of specific causes that we see from flooding a bunch. One of them is intense local thunderstorms, and this is exactly what we have here in southern Arizona with our monsoon storms, where there's a whole lot of water that falls in a very short period of time. And so that's a cool shot of a monsoon, and on the right, some monsoon damage from a few years ago in downtown Phoenix. That is the roof of a gas station. Big weather system like hurricanes. Hurricanes create some of the biggest flood losses in the U.S. are because of hurricanes. And the flooding from hurricanes come not only from the rain falling, because you obviously do have high levels of rain during hurricanes, but you also have something called the storm surge, which means the ocean is just a lot taller. There's a big bulge on the top of the ocean under a hurricane. And some of the worst hurricanes, like during Hurricane Katrina, between the wind whipping up really big waves and that storm surge itself, kind of the bump on the hurricane, the water can be as much as like 30 feet higher and 30 feet above sea level, and then it pushes inland. And so that's what causes most of the flooding during hurricanes. Springtime is flooding season, and it is because of snowmelt from up north, kind of added along with these storms that happen as cold air masses from Canada meet up with warm air masses from the Gulf of Mexico. And those cold fronts, I know that's what triggers a lot of our thunderstorms and tornadoes during this springtime part of the year. But that snow melt causes flooding, and you see Fargo always floods. But what's sort of interesting is, if you remember, this is part of the Mississippi River drainage basin. So lots of snow melting in Fargo means that Mississippi and Louisiana has flooding. And so those factors, it may not even be something happening where you are. It might just be far up the drainage basin. And in some cases, these floods that work their way down the Mississippi River, they'll actually, a few years ago, they actually started blowing up levees along it, like in Missouri, to try to flood out less populated places to sort of save some of those bigger cities downstream, like St. Louis or New Orleans. Now, of course, something completely not weather related is tsunami as well, because you do have a big wave of ocean water coming onto land in these cases. This is a satellite of Banda Aceh right after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. So you can see that used to be all agricultural land, and now it is flooded out. For places that are affected by tsunami, sometimes that flooding is because the land has dropped due to tectonic subsidence. And sometimes it's just, the water standing there, but that's all salt water. So it actually reduces the amount of agriculture that you can do in the future. One of the other things that contribute to flooding is urbanization. So if you look at this hydrograph, it shows you the curve of rainfall. So when the rain falls versus when flooding happens. Initially, the flooding would happen sort of over a longer period of time, but not be so severe. But thanks to urbanization, mainly in the form of like covering up the land, covering up the ground where water has no place to sink in. Building freeways, building Walmarts with giant concrete parking lots. Those are some of the big things that create this urbanization. You can see there's a higher peak, so the flood doesn't last as long, but it's a whole lot worse when it's happening. What's kind of interesting is, since I'm recording this during the COVID remote learning here, it's sort of opposite of the flattening the curve we want to do for the COVID. Urbanization is what would happen if we didn't do social distancing. It doesn't last as long, but it's a whole lot worse. But by all of us staying home right now, we flattened out that curve, so it doesn't get as bad, although it lasts a little bit longer. This is kind of an interesting comparison there for you. All right. So let's look at this next session, flood prevention. How do we prevent a flood from happening in the first place? Well, you don't. And in fact, most of the things we actually do to change streams make it worse, or makes it better where we are and makes it worse elsewhere. And so kind of the hard part here with pretty much any of these flood control measures is that there's benefits in certain areas, but there's some pretty serious drawbacks that come along with them too. So artificial levees, and we talk about the levees in New Orleans. This is what failed and created the floodings during Hurricane Katrina, is the failure of the levees. All the flooding didn't happen while the hurricane was coming in. The flooding happened the next day and after that, because that's when the levees failed. So an artificial levee is built sometimes just out of rocks. They could be earthen levees, and sometimes they're concrete. But the point of the levees is to raise the banks up. So you're increasing your Q max by increasing the depth of the channel. But like we learned in New Orleans, these can fail. But the other thing is when you overtop the levees and the water spills into these homes you see in the picture right behind them, Lord have mercy, those have got to be in a flood zone. Once the water spills there, those levees are in the way, so the water can't drain back to the river. And so it leads to kind of longer periods of flooding until they can pump the water out, or the water all evaporates or finally sinks in. And so here's some of those examples of the levees failing in New Orleans. They replaced them. The Army Corps of Engineers spent like billions of dollars building new levees, but thanks to subsidence of the Gulf of Mexico basin, and I know when we talked about groundwater, I mentioned natural subsidence there, and because of rising sea levels, they're pretty much useless at this point already. They were pretty much useless by the time they finished the levee projects. New Orleans shouldn't be where it is. That's kind of all there is to New Orleans, unfortunately. I got a lot of those. Retention ponds. If you live in like a housing development, or anywhere near a housing development around here, they all have green belts. And one of the big things that happens in the green belts is you get these really low areas, and that's where water drains to when it floods. And so this is a park that they built in Riverside, California. Oh, here you go. This is called Don Durr Park. I guess it's named after somebody. So Riverside had a problem with flooding, and they're like, well, we're going to build a big retention pond and fill it up with water when it floods. But they don't want to do that in a neighborhood. Obviously, they don't want to do it where like commercial real estate happens. You don't want, water standing in places where you can use that land. And so they made it into a park. It's actually kind of beautiful. You can see there's baseball fields down at the bottom of this retention pond. So that during those floods, you get water in your baseball field, but not in homes. It's actually kind of beautiful. And we use those all around Arizona, here in southern Arizona. It's a really common thing as well. You see them off the sides of the freeways all the time too, because we don't have a stormwater kind of drainage system here. Now, you can also use dams. This is Roosevelt Dam, just east of Phoenix. The good news is here, this actually wasn't built for flood control though. Roosevelt Dam and pretty much all the dams along the Salton and the Verde were formed just to create those lakes behind them to act as a water source for the Phoenix area, because we're in a desert and we have a lot of people here. But a lot of dams can be built in order to help control the flooding. That's one of the reasons why the Three Gorges Dam was built. So it's kind of nice because they offer recreation on top of that flooding prevention. And also, if it's a hydroelectric dam, it can be an energy source. The hard part is dams are pretty much never a good idea because of the big change they make to the just to the entire ecology of the ground that is around there. Those higher water levels in the reservoir lead to a lot more landslides. I mentioned earthquakes earlier, and then of course you always have this risk of the dam failure, and it does happen every once in a while. If you really want an interesting story, look up the Johnstown flood. This happened back in the 1880s. I'm sorry, I don't have a date right now. In Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and it's a terrible story that kind of shows you how bad the rich folk are too. But there was a dam to make a little lake in a place where a lot of the rich from like Pittsburgh, like a lot of your railroad barons, that they had like summer homes along this lake, and they'd go in summer there. And the dam wasn't well taken care of, and over either Memorial Day or Labor Day, there was a bunch of flooding, and that particular dam failed, and it swept all the way down into Johnstown, Pennsylvania. At the time, it was one of the deadliest events in U.S. history. This was also the first time that the American Red Cross was activated and came in for relief. The picture on the left there's a bunch of like drawings and some pretty famous images of the tree through the house. But the picture on the left is the Stone Arch Bridge. This is where most of the deaths actually happened because as all the water and the debris came rushing downstream, when it got to this arch bridge, it backed up. And so there was this giant pile of debris backing up behind the arch bridge. And for some reason, it caught fire. And so it burned while the flooding was happening too, which was pretty wild. The bridge still stands, so you can still visit it. But the Johnstown flood is a pretty famous deadly flooding event. So we can also do channelization, and we saw this along the Salt River, where rather than letting the river do its thing and move around, you give it a channel to stay in. And this can protect the areas on either side of the channelized area from flooding. But what it does do is it increases flooding upstream, because now you've got that kind of more narrow area you're trying to force all the water into during a flooding event when your queue goes up. And a lot of time it just can't handle that amount of discharge. So you get a lot of flooding upstream of these channels, which is pretty scary. The other thing that can happen here is it affects wildlife too, because a lot of times these are lined in concrete. So you take away sort of the natural area. The water moves a lot faster through here. And so like fish that build little, that build nest and lay their eggs on the bottom, they can't spawn very well. Birds that usually would come down and float on the water and feed on those fish, now the water is going too fast and they can't land there. So this has a pretty big effect on the wildlife in general. Now, of course, we need to talk about hazards really, really quick. I promise it's going to be quick here for you. The biggest hazard is death, and we've talked about that quite a bit already. So hopefully I have ingrained in you just how important it is to not drive through flooded areas. I gave you the numbers for flash flood deaths. In Texas, over 75% of flash flood deaths are in vehicles. I usually attribute that to people driving big trucks and thinking they're high enough to stay out of the water. But if you remember when I was talking about sediment load earlier, as the water slows down, it's got to put that sediment somewhere, and it just deposits it wherever the water slows down. And unfortunately, in this case, it deposited it in this house. So it leaves quite a mess behind. That water damage can also get into your walls. Remember, I mentioned that some of these flooding events happen for months on end. So if your house is wet with standing water for like 6 months, your walls, the drywall, it's made out of gypsum. And that sucks up all the water that's in the ground, and you can see it sucking um, you know, the water reaching up the drywall. In these pictures, you can even see like where the cross beams are on the studs, which is sort of interesting, but you can see that mold setting in. And at this point, you pretty much have to take the whole house down, rip it down to studs, and treat the 2x4s for mold. And there's a pretty specific thing you have to do to the 2x4s of your house to treat the mold, because this can be toxic and make people really sick over time. There's another picture of mud left behind thanks to a flooding event. You also have a pollution problem afterwards. So agriculture. On the left, you can see this field is flooded, which means crops aren't growing. And that can cause a problem. And here in the U.S., you know, a lot of our grains are grown along the Mississippi River. They call it the breadbasket of the U.S. because of the amount of grains and wheat and oat that are all grown through there. The big cash crop that a lot of these places have turned to is corn, and corn is in literally everything. Anybody with corn allergies knows this. Our food is sweetened with corn. It's an additive in like everything. We run our cars on corn, on ethanol. And so it drives up a lot of prices for food and fuel. And then on top of that, the pollution problem. When we had a couple hurricanes along the East Coast in the last couple of years, one of the biggest concerns was the pig farms. Because when you have a lot of pigs, you got a lot of pig poop. And when you have a lot of pig poop, you have a lot of microorganisms that end up in that water. So you end up risking the water from the pig farm floating down into the water over here in the field of food crops. And you risk contamination from E. coli and a lot of really yucky kind of stuff. Or when it affects petroleum, the petroleum industry. There's a lot of refineries down along the Gulf Coast that are affected by hurricanes and stuff. And so those are other examples where you have pollution problems thanks to these. Here's one of the funniest stories. And by funny, I mean just ironic, maybe. I think there's a lot of irony here. This is Grand Forks, North Dakota. On April 19th, 1997, Grand Forks flooded. 'Tis that time of year, right? Because you got a lot of snow melt coming from up north. People went to work that morning, but as the water started rising, they started evacuating downtown. By kind of midday, they'd evacuated something like 50,000 people from Grand Forks. At 4:15 p.m., somebody reported a fire in the downtown area. Unfortunately, they couldn't put the fire out. Now, you would think things wouldn't be on fire in the middle of a flood, but it totally did here. They couldn't put the fire out. If you notice, our Happy Fire engine here is actually on a semi, because what they found was their fire engines are diesel fuel, and when they'd try to go through the floodwaters would get pulled into the diesel engine and then die on them. So they ended up actually putting the engines on semis and military vehicles where the engines were higher up so they could drive through part of the flooded water. But basically, they just had to sit around and let the whole downtown business district burn to the ground. And of course, they were busy trying to rescue people too. So the fire department put rescues as a higher priority than actually fighting the fire. And so by like 8 p.m. that night, it was still burning, and they just let it burn for however long it took. So yeah. So flooding, it's you don't think of it as sort of scary and dangerous, but it honestly can be, particularly those flash floods.